we had an initiative called the Open Collaboration that was supported by google.org to look across our value chain to see where we could remove friction, where we could improve data, look for opportunities for efficiencies, but also for climate justice, as I mentioned, making sure that communities were part of the equation and considered and benefiting from it, that the developing world had equitable market access. So we looked in 3 stages. We had 3 working groups. We had a digital MRV side to get that data, get better data more efficiently. Looking at kind of the middleware, how do you have open APIs that connect with the ecosystem, both on the supply and the demand side. And then on the demand side, looking at digital asset creation, tokenization, other ways to use technology to actually contribute to the topic that we'll talk about today, which is the title here is Discovering a Global Climate Asset Price. It'll be interesting to see if the answer is yes, we can discover a climate asset price, or at least start converging and having more sense and discoverability to that. So with that, I'd like to introduce the panelists. Christophe Boulcaille, who's Managing Director at Cultivo, Matthew Lawrenson, who's President and COO at Tollum, and Alexis Leroy, who is the founder and CEO of Olcott. So I'd like to start with you, Christophe, if I may. We were just talking before the session about we're in the tech space here. What can we learn about, what does the tech community have to learn about commodities trading, the investment space, and specifically in carbon markets? And then if you could speak a little bit about how the Carbon Opportunities Fund sees the market and pricing.
Okay, I'm going to, if possible, can you hear me?
I can, but I don't know if they can.
Apologies, must be running out of battery. So I'm going to actually start with addressing the second part of the question, because it will hopefully make sense in terms of what our view of the market is, or how we see the market pricing, and how the initiative here can actually help to improve it. So starting with the Carbon Opportunities Fund, this is an initiative we put together. It was cornerstoned by the IFC, International Finance Corporation, which is part of the World Bank Group, to help bring transparency, reduce friction in carbon markets through implementing, making POCs, so proof of concept, trades and implementations of digitalization, digital data, both on the trading side using blockchain, but also in creating more information about projects. One of the main initiatives or main purposes has been to effectively operationalize the Climate Action Data Trust, which is a harmonization between registries, and we have started on that journey. But the reason this is very interesting, the Hedera ecosystem is, well, Guardian, to be more precise, system is so interesting, is because that is a different angle on project that increases the transparency on the project and therefore the trust and the information available for the end buyers. So we put together this initiative, and we're really here to help have this marketplace develop. Now, going on to the sort of the how we see this market and where we see this could develop, and I really invite any either opposing or confirming views, because it's always good to have a little bit of a debate going. But my background is commodities trading. I've been a commodities trader for 20 years, and primarily agricultural commodities. But I was given carbon markets in the early 2000s when they first came out, and I sort of stuck with it, or it stuck with me. I'm not sure how best to describe it. But effectively, one of the things that I think most people don't necessarily realize who are not in the commodities world is that commodities don't have one uniform price and don't have one uniform quality. So if you look at something like crude oil, everybody quotes either the WTI, the West Texas International, or Brent crude, but that will have a certain set of specifications in terms of sourness or heaviness or quality, heaviness, corrosiveness effectively, and then that will be the reference price against which all other commodities are priced. A better example is probably if you have a bushel of corn that has been grown non-synthetic, non-pesticide, so effectively regenerative, organic certified way, and it goes into a premium breakfast cereal, cornflakes, versus the bushel of corn that you give to the animals. Okay, so one will trade at a 30, sometimes even 50, 60% price premium to the other. The way it differs from carbon markets is that ultimately, if I give you a bushel of corn, if I give you a barrel of oil, you'll be able to do something with it. You know, it's got a very clear end use or demand usage. The problem with carbon is because you're not at the moment mandated to offset every single footprint of carbon you create with an equivalent like for like, the price of these claims, the price that you pay as a corporate, because it's voluntary in many instances, is entirely dependent on how much you're willing to pay for it. And in some cases, you would say, okay, this is a nice to have rather than a must have, and therefore I will choose not to purchase it. Whereas when it comes to food or energy, it's more of a must have. So where it ties in with what we're trying to do here is that when I have a bushel of corn, I'm able to figure out what it is based on measuring its contents. But when I have a carbon claim, at the moment, I don't know if that claim is being falsely made or is a true representation of reality, because the information I have on the quantification is actually obscured either by lack of available information or just no information at all. So creating better information availability either through digital satellite MRV. So what I mean by that, by way of example, if someone says I've planted a forest, unless I go there and measure every single tree trunk and convince myself the project is there, the only other way I can at the moment justify it is if I have the satellite data available and if I track tree growth over time. But that data is not widely available. So what we're trying to create here is work together both with a project developer such as Allcode, as well as the wider Hedera, Guardian marketplace, including Tolam, to try and create all of that information and take it to the end buyer and say, look, this unit of carbon, which represents a ton of, sorry, this unit of claim, which represents a ton of carbon, is really there. And the Guardian newspaper, or anyone criticizing you for this not being the case, you don't have to worry about it, because all the satellite imagery is there, plain and clear for everybody to see, and that creates trust, and that level of transparency is hopefully what will increase the price. So that's a very long-winded way of introducing both myself and what it is that we're trying to do with the Carbon Opportunities Fund initiative.
Thanks a lot, Christoph. So it's clear that more data is needed, and I think my view would be that there is a lot of data available, but is it accessible? Is it clear? Do as an investor know what it means? Can they, and is the trust there? So maybe Matthew, can you talk a little bit about Tolam and how you're working on deriving price models from project data based on?
Certainly. So the way we go about discovering a price is really to collect together as much data as we can that has some kind of influence on the price, something that might cause somebody to choose a higher or a lower price. And then when we collect that, we look for patterns within that. So we try and explain those choices. And you can kind of do it in your head a little bit. So if it's this registry, if it's in this location, this vintage, it's this price, and a different set of things will be a different price. And of course, that works for these very simple cases, but this soon gets far too complicated for a human to do. So you have to deploy techniques such as machine learning, data analytics in order to do that. And this can be done using information from PDDs, using information that's currently available with surprisingly good results. So we've run models and we can explain the variance of kind of 20 to 30, sometimes more attributes to a ton of carbon. Now, there is a lot of ways that this can be improved. So this kind of also relates to the discussion I think that's been ongoing through the day a little bit about digitization versus digital native information. So we heard in one of the earlier panels about how it's possible to translate information. So how can we make a more standard data set by using machine learning, for example, to use translation, to classify data, to make it into a more structured data set. And this will help, but it's kind of like photocopy and a photocopy and then a photocopy. So the image becomes slightly less sharp over time and the data becomes less clear. But what we're able to do, I mean, in the context of this discussion with the Hedera ecosystem and the Hedera Guardian, is produce a digital native data set. So this is where we have structured data, there's a standard data pattern, a DMRV that's really generating that data natively in this structured format. And this is really like a 4K screen compared to the photocopy that I mentioned before. So the ability to then extract the carbon price from that is far greater than otherwise would be possible. The other advantage it brings is that we can also have more attributes. So because we're now a digital platform, there's new data sources that we can add into that platform. There's new attributes that we can bring to bear to discover how they affect the patterns of that price. And as well as the breadth of attributes, there's also the depth of attributes. So digital information or sensor gathered data can often be collected far more frequently than if you had to fly out and measure the circumference of trees. Okay, it can be turned into an active monitoring. So this means that instead of just a static at issuance understanding of the asset, we can track it over time. We can see if the forest has been cut down. Okay, so again, the quality of our understanding of the asset and the pricing of that asset increases. And then just lastly, we can also bring to bear other data sets. So there's other things that influence the price of the asset, not just the ecological veracity of that asset. So one of the themes of today is the equity of finance, effectively. So there's another set of data that can be generated at trade. So how much do people pay for the asset in relation to, for example, the distribution of funds? So if somebody were to know that at the point of purchase of this particular carbon credit, that this much money would go to the project developer, and from that amount, this much would go to the communities, and from that amount, this much would go to some kind of entity associated with a social development goal, so a school or some kind of health facility that's been supported. That information will also influence the price that people are willing to pay. So what we're able to do going forward is to gather that data as well and bring that into the pattern to see if we can see how that influences the price that people will pay.
And when you think about these attributes, what does it look like now? How has it evolved over time? Is it possible that we might overwhelm with so many attributes? Which are the most valued now, and how do you see that moving in the future?
So the overwhelming question is interesting because I've listened to the panels today, and I think one of the tipping points we're currently at, so we talk about the Hedera ecosystem, and there's the platform called the Guardian. So this is a workflow engine that's really generating huge, or has the potential to generate huge data sets of structured data. Okay, so this was not available before. We're at a point where we have access to some capability that we didn't have. And actually, the use of large data sets and the use of machine learning and algorithm data has influenced or radically changed all our lives in this room. Okay, it's massively changed industries like finance, like insurance, marketing, retail, but really it's not touched what we're doing here yet at all. Okay, so I think one thing that will change hugely is the discussions that I've heard are a little bit like, how can we do the jobs that we're currently doing better by having access to this data? And one thing that we can consider in the future is the jobs will just radically change. They won't be the same at all. So access to these data sets means that we'll just do things completely differently.
Alexis, I would like to ask you more about the kind of transparency on the pricing side, but can I ask you first the same question? What do you see when you engage with buyers? What attributes now are the biggest value carriers beyond the integrity of the carbon? And how do you see that changing over time?
Thank you. So we're a project developer. We've been doing this for 14 years, so we're not legally for the US, but clearly in France we can. And there's been a lot of change overall throughout those years. So when we started out, we were really working under the Kyoto Protocol paradigm, where 30x country acknowledge that they need to compensate, and you have about 130 odd countries that says yes, you should. And we evolved with the Sustainable Development Goals, which were created in 2012, and I'd like to recall in Colombia by two women, which then gave us the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement. And that really shifts the whole narrative from a climate conversation to an impact conversation. And when we look at the 8 years after Paris, and we're here at COP, we're still haggling around Article 6, which is really the money article, with Article 6.2 and Article 6.4. And while we're pledging a tremendous amount of money for loss and benefit, etc., the money is not going into the field, the money is not hitting the ground or the project. And what we see when we discuss with buyers, and I'd like to talk about investor today more than buyers, is that A, they're terrified because nobody wants to be in the Guardian, and two, there is a big lack also of transparency. So this is one of the drive for us to work with EDERA and the Guardian. It was how do we break the nebulosa, and how do we put everything available to the investors and the buyers and the stakeholders. So our point of view, and here Christophe and I differ, is that carbon is not a commodity. Carbon is probably the most formidable instrument, financial instrument, to rewire the economy and the society. And if it's such, it needs to be transparent, and we need also to have a price mechanism that is logical. So it shouldn't be just about the CO2 component, but it also be about, you mentioned climate justice, it should be also about social justice. What do we leave behind? Today with the Article 6, for instance, there is no mechanism where it says that the mitigation that is exported should also allow and enable a mitigation on the country that will have the export of that mitigation. Because clearly, reminded this morning, we have 280 billion tons of CO2 missing to meet our NDC. So clearly, carbon will allow us to get us there. It's not just investment in others. So, those emissions will come from the global south. They're not going to come from the G20 countries, although they need 80% of this capital of CO2. So if we want this to work, we need to find a mechanism whereby we take into consideration local mitigation, the exported mitigation, and all the social cost that goes around it, whether it's education and health and capacity building, and effective transfer of technology, because otherwise we're repeating a neo-liberal or colonialist, if you want to call it, approach. So I think that today the tech enables us to do that. There's a lot of data points. There's a lot of enablers. The real question is, will the project developer put all that information available? Do we want to be transparent about it or not? And I think that's what allow us to effectively unlock the trillions. Then when it comes to implementation of projects, I do believe that technology is greatly needed to accelerate, because we don't have time to write PDDs. We don't have time to send teams into the heart of the jungle to measure the size of the trees. And we don't have time to learn capacity, because very few people, don't speak Paris. And those who are familiar with the carbon industry, most of us are starting to have white hair. And there's not a new generation coming to take over, because the industry is still very poor. And although we have those millions and trillions pledged, and very few understand how does a monitoring system work, how do you build a PDD, and you have a lot of talent out there, but they don't speak carbon and they don't speak Paris. And I think the technology should be deployed to enable that. We should also have open source capacity building, not only for the north, but essentially also for the south, because the project should come from the stakeholder. And that's one thing that Idrissa reminded us this morning. You know, very often we don't take into consideration the government where we operate, and that's very true in the voluntary market space. And that's, you know, a big mistake, because we've seen some of the countries now are reacting with taxes and regulation, where the only thing that is keeping this whole thing alive effectively is the VCM, until we find the solution of the Great Article 6 and the local population, because they know the necessity, they know the field better than anybody.
So can I ask, go back to you, Alexis, don't put the the microphone down, sorry. But just concretely, so there's, you know, we're talking about having more data available, discoverable, transparent, but concretely, do you see a tangible link to the exposure specifically of the financial data to a higher price being paid?
The short answer is yes, and I tell you why. Today, we have carbon credits that are being traded at, you know, I think less than $1, and I never thought we would see that today. We also see that the EU ETS, for instance, is very comfortable at around 80 euro, more or less. And I think there's about 50 million contracts that are being traded every day. And that tells you that the European industrial rather pay 80 euro than invest into structural technology that will effectively reduce their emission. Now, why would anyone pay 80 euro for a carbon credit today? Well, it is a voluntary endeavor, although we could say that it's a pre-regulation endeavor. You know, I think the Carbon Border Adjustment Regulation and other tell us that it's coming, and it's coming fast, and the market is short, so people should invest into project, really. But nobody is going to pay premium dollar if they don't know that that money is going to have a real impact. And it's not going to benefit, for instance, Olcott, you know. So we need to be transparent on our margin, and we need to ask high price versus high quality and high integrity. And that's where I insist on that. I think it's a financial instrument, not just a commodity. So you're not getting a barrel of oil, but you are financing a transfer of technology, you are financing social impact, you're financing health, and you're financing basically the cost of whatever you are producing that is deteriorating an ecosystem. So you're balancing, basically.
So on that point of this not being a commodity, which goes back, I'll go to Christophe and Matthew, whoever wants to take this question actually. Back to what I started with, are we headed towards a global climate asset price, or are we looking at, you know, different tiers or different standard contracts? How do you see the price landscape evolving, considering better available data over time?
So I'm going to take my take on it, and please feel free to take yours. So I actually stick with the statement that I do think it's a commodity, but not necessarily because I disagree with Alexis. I think we both agree it's a question of use of language more than anything. But it's a commodity in the sense that, as I described, a bushel of corn that has been regeneratively grown, organically certified, not using chemicals, will always trade at a premium. It's still a commodity, but it will trade at a premium to the reference price on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, because the price there will be the quality that goes to the animals. So, you know, that won't necessarily be that high. But if you are having a unit of carbon allowance that is given to you freely from the European Union, I would 100% agree with Alexis that the one which is actually sequestering carbon from the atmosphere and comes with tons of co-benefits, such as benefits for the wider community, for biodiversity, for water use, and then this is the punchline, you can actually verify it with lots and lots of data, and the more the better, I would say. The market will decide what data they take seriously or not. I think that would trade at a premium. But right now, if I'm the end buyer, I can be certain I pay 80 euros per ton for the carbon allowance that is trading in the compliance markets, and that has me okay. If I pay less than a dollar for an equally good, if not better, unit of carbon that is actually taking carbon out of the atmosphere rather than just giving me a permission to pollute, but I don't know and I can't explain to my customers that this is the case, then that's why I'm not prepared to pay the full price. That's not me not prepared to, that's what I see, I think, end clients do. So, yeah.
So I think that actually we're all in agreement. So I think you've done a beautiful job of guiding the panel through this to agreement, because when we think about the barrel of oil versus the other example, the barrel of oil has different attributes that can affect its price. But we're talking 6 to 10, I don't know exactly, but a small number. With carbon credits, we're talking far more and much more diverse attributes. So social justice is one, right? That's difficult to quantify. So
It can be done.
So I think by understanding all those attributes, you can have a global price, but that actually means a global price model. It's not a single price, but by understanding those attributes, attitudes to those attributes, and the certainty of those attributes, then for a given set of them, you'll be able to decide what the price is. But it's far more complex than 6 or 7 attributes of a barrel of oil.
And
If it's possible, I'd like to add on that. And it's, considerations while we're at COP. So, we've seen that there are some countries that are moving in 6.2 concretely. Those countries are paying between $25 to $35 in a market that is, between $1 and on a good day with maybe $15. And one would say it's formidable, because they're paying X amount of oil on the current price. Now, the consideration I have is those countries have a structural abatement cost that would usually be 10 times the price they're paying, So how also do we get sure that there's an alignment between the structural cost of an abatement or a transactional cost through an instrument like carbon credits? And the thought was that when it's government, it should be maybe indexed on the structural cost of what you would have if you would invest into technology or others. But still, you would need to have a high level of transparency and a lot of data points that you can verify to make sure that that money is effectively used to support the NDC of the exporting country.
And so 2 questions come to mind on this now. Given this is a voluntary in many cases, and given that currently today the incentives are limited for companies to commit, and I think we had a couple of years of real optimism that buyer demand would increase, and so supply started to increase further. So when you have a supply and demand imbalance, how does that, is that just a reality of the market? Are there safeguards that should and could come into play? Price floors, things like this?
If I may comment on it, I don't think you need price floors. I think you just need to look at the more grown-up capital markets, including the commodities markets, and borrow from those ideas, because they have developed over many hundreds of years. And one of the development that I think is encouraging, and is Alexis will get the $1 to the $80 within 10 years, I think, is that increasingly you're seeing the mandated markets, so European Union, California, for example. European Union doesn't do it yet, but Australia, New Zealand, you are not just automatically being given a free permit to pollute, and the number that is handed out to industry reduces each year. That's how emission trading systems are designed. But in many cases, and Australia and Canada have been leaders in this, you're able to replace some of the shortfall that you don't have handed out by effectively all the methodologies that we use in the voluntary market. So you can plant trees, you can even preserve forests, you can do all sorts of things. And I think once there is a greater convergence, fungibility, effectively, between these contracts that are described at the moment as voluntary, independently verified, and the mandated markets where if you're an industry and you don't cancel out your carbon footprint, you basically get locked down by the government or shut down by the government. The more we see convergence, that effectively allows, the more we see fungibility, that allows the price of the voluntary, what are seen as voluntary contracts at the moment, to be dragged up. The more we can augment it with data that validates that that ton of carbon claim is indeed a ton of carbon claim, rather than it could be half a ton, could be 1.5, we don't know. The more I think the two markets converge, and hopefully everything will go up and the cost of pollution for everybody goes up, going back to your marginal abatement cost, but there will be greater convergence, because in no commodities market do I see a spread of anywhere between under $1 and up to 80 euros, which is, let's call it $95. That's just, I'm sorry, that doesn't exist.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because there are some price distortions that have come from decisions that outside the market, like things like the Science Based Targets Initiative has recognized a removal as more valuable or qualifies for a net zero claim and not an avoidance or an emission reduction. So I guess that's another external driver that we need to reckon with, and there may be others.
Just to add on that, I think that just underlies the point I was trying to make, is that this is very much a policy-driven market, and as a consequence, impossible to analyze from a supply and demand perspective. And maybe that's where I do agree with Alexis, that it's not a commodity.
All right, Matthew, do you have anything to add on this point? No. Okay. I think what we're hearing is a reference price with variation that can be substantiated and driven by good data and transparent price discovery. I have one more question about the technology. And I'll bring this to you, Matthew, if I may. We talked about the opportunities for AI, machine learning. Have you given thought to any risks that might be associated with those types of models in this context?
To risks?
Yeah.
In the context of a price discovery?
Or just generally in the market, using such tools?
Yeah. So I think, that there's risks that at the beginning it won't be complete data. It will be wrong. Okay, so we have a whole set of, or a period of time where it'll be kind of guidance. It will need to converge on accurate results. But I think maybe taking a completely different approach, one risk is that if we think about AI, machine learning, and where the kind of consolidation of those technologies are, once again, they're in the richer countries. Once again, they're in the countries that have got high levels of education, high levels of access to technology. So we need to do this, I think, but we need to do this in a way that takes into account the digital divide. We need to do it in a way that encourages and helps people to learn. So Alexi was talking about the white hair. Where are the people after white hair? I wish I had the white hair, but we can think. So if we think about data science, there's a very famous kind of open course, Andrew Ng. And he is teaching, and he uses the Boston real estate market as the example. And in fact, most courses do this. So all over Africa, all over Latin America, there's people using this online learning course because that's the only actual education of this type they have access to. And they're all experts in variations in Boston apartments. So I think one thing that we can kind of do as a community is get those data sets together that reflect things that are relevant to those countries, put them in a way that they're easily accessible, and allow people to learn data science, to learn these skills using this kind of data. So then there will be a kind of local expertise in carbon, in climate, in using data science for that purpose, and that will hopefully help address the digital divide to some degree.
Here, here. Very interested in capacity development generally, digital tools included. Do I have a time check? Wes has vanished, but until I'm told to stop, I'm going to turn. 7 minutes, perfect. That's great for turning to you in the audience. Are there questions for the panelists? Renat. We'll need to give you a microphone.
I believe the root cause of why people are so agitated is ultimately not the projects, it's the fear that carbon credits could be used anyhow as a kind of a license to pollute. And I think in the past that was not such a big thing, because climate change was so much not on the agenda that anybody doing anything was seen as a good person. But now I think that has changed. What does the panel think? How can we get that messaging, that narrative back on track, that carbon credits are a financial instrument to promote action beyond NDCs in host countries, but are by no means seen as kind of any kind of license to pollute? What do you think? How can we fix that?
So Tollum Earth is an exchange, so it's a place where you could buy carbon credits and use them to offset. Okay, so in one way, we're fueling the behavior that you're describing, so people can buy from Tollum Earth instead of reducing their carbon and claim to be net zero. But actually, what the data shows is that companies that do offset are actually reducing their carbon emissions faster than companies that don't. Okay, so if you want to travel light, pack your own suitcase. If you're buying carbon to create a cost against your emissions, then you will take the burden of that cost and you will try and reduce it. So there's a set of behavior that is exactly as you described, which is not what we want to happen. But there's also ways to encourage people to buy offsets against specific emissions, to understand within their organization what is causing that burden and then reduce it. And I think if we can encourage that kind of behavior, then hopefully that will lead to the outcomes that we're looking for.
I'm fully aware of the studies, and it's absolutely clear that whoever offsets reduces more. The problem is that this narrative does not seem to be taken up by the public audience. That's the problem. Even if it's totally true, it somehow doesn't seem to hit The Guardian and other media. So nonetheless, the question remains.
So I have this for you, if you want, if I may. I think there's one of our collective mistake is that very often we put just forward the ton of CO2, and everything has been around the ton of CO2 narrative. And we don't have tools that really highlight where is the money going and how is it translated into impact. So recently, David was referring to a methodology we developed, and we invite everybody to come on that. We developed a methodology that works with a validation verification system where we validate what's the governance of the project, so how are the co-benefits going to be distributed, who decided, and follow the money and translate it into SDG, so effectively creating an SDG tool. And I think this type of initiative will allow to assure the investor rather than the buyer that, you know, South Pole and Olcott are not making trillions of billions, but that we're actually creating an impact on the ground, and how does that impact is being translated in education, in better quality of water, in electricity access and others, and how does it yield year after year, because those projects are long-term projects, and how it generates the impact.
Yeah, I think, just quickly, that was an excellent point made by Stephanie, I think, in an earlier panel. Who's the beneficiary of the carbon market? It's the communities, okay? So if people think the beneficiary is big business, getting some kind of financial gain, getting some get-out-of-jail card for polluting, then that narrative will prevail. So we have to tell the story and explain and show with data the distribution of funds to show that these people are benefiting from the carbon market.
Great. Next question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to ask
Could you
about-
introduce yourself?
Yeah,
and
Michael
let us
from the
know
Sutu.
if there's
do-
someone you want to answer specifically.
Yes. I do carbon projects since 10 years, CDM Gold Standard. When I look in the registry, I see most of the emission reductions are not retired. So I agree with Christoph that it's a commodity. People buy for 18, they sell for 18.50 within a bank. It goes. But the moment you retire, then you want to have a high value. So the issue of retirement is still a vague issue. And nobody really addresses that issue. Can we talk a little bit about it? Thank you very much.
It's difficult. So why are carbon credits not being retired? I mean, if you look at it as any commodities market, it's more supply out there than demand, I guess. And that's where the crossover, the more mandated nature, whether it's through an actual policy or if you're a consumer-facing brand, to be able to do business only if you either eliminate or offset your footprint. I think that would be the solution. That's my take. But you're right, it is a big gap. It's a very big gap.
Christopher, I thought you were going to talk about commodities and spec on that one, but Christophe is right. First thing, you have much more offering than demand, and we should look at who are the main buyers. So there are great corporate companies that buy every year and that, effectively retire those credits, but a lot of liquidity has been provided by very sophisticated trading desks, oils and gas, industrial, and it's clearly spec. So, the real question should be, how do we tackle that? And spec is not evil. We need it because it provides liquidity, but how do we make sure that, part of the proceed of that speculation effectively goes back to the community, because that's where it should go. And I think that's where technology would allow us to trace, the money and trace the exchange or the fungibility of those credits and ensure that each time the community gets a cut. And I think that's how we solve the problem.
Christoph.
Sorry, you're right, and I didn't address that. My fault. This is very interesting, this market, in the sense that if you look at a typical, let's say, soy, right, which or any other market that is used by industry to hedge, you will have maybe 2, 3, maybe 5, at max 10% of participation by speculators, by effectively hedgers who buy and sell these credits for financial gain. In this market, and I haven't seen analysis, but my bet would be it's 8% speculative capital and 20% actually used for end retirement, and that is a market failure, right? So yeah, and I think it's a big problem. I think to unleash demand would be that the speculators position themselves to sell on to the end buyers, but the end buyers are not buying. So our job as an industry, and again, that's one of the things that we have been doing a lot, and a lot more than I had anticipated, we are educating the end buyers who then buy it to retire against their carbon footprint, to say what is good, what good looks like, what is bad, and how you use digital MRV to determine what is good. And again, that information is not widely available, which is why we're very keen to participate in this initiative together with ARCOT and Tolam. Did you say 80% or 80%? My guess is 80.
80.
But it's just completely my guess looking at markets.
All right. Well, I think we're hearing more data, more attribute discovery, price discovery can lead to, hopefully a virtuous circle of higher prices, while we also need to do the work of providing incentives and clarity for the drivers for buyers and ensure equitable access and benefit sharing through the value chain to the communities and beneficiaries of projects. So thank you very much. Thank the panel, please, and thanks to HPAR.
And as we're about to take another 10 to 15-minute break, we're going to have a quick lightning demo talk by Matthew Lawrenson to talk about Tolam Earth and the ARM. So if you want to see more, want to learn more, that's going to be over there breaking down the attributes of pricing and going through a quick demo. And if not, we'll be back here in about 15 minutes. Thank you. Thank you again, Sarah, and all the panelists.